theory, performance, rhythm, harmony, line and form, acoustics, notation, orchestration, neurology, and perception. These are the keys to understanding music. Hello, and welcome to Understanding Music. Today we're going to talk about the notes. For the last 700 years or so, we've used a system called standard notation. Standard notation represents the sounds that we hear with little oval shapes that are written on the staff, depending on the shape of the note that has to do with its duration. And there is sometimes extra information above and below the staff that tells us how to play the notes, whether they're loud or soft, and other information about how the passage is to be played. We'll look at those things later. Today we're going to concentrate on how to take a particular pitch or sound and represent it with a shape. The staff is a type of system. One of the definitions of the word system in music is when you take a single element and you repeat it a number of times to make up another thing, and then you use that thing as a single element. In this case, we take a single line and we turn it into a set of 5, and those 5 lines together is called a staff. We can also take multiple staves, the plural of staff, and put them together into a larger system that could show what a number of different instruments are playing, like a whole woodwind section. We can also take different sets of this system and put them together to show different groups of instruments, like you might have in a page of a score for a symphony orchestra. Okay, now we have to take a look at a couple of symbols. In the days of plain song, notes were square shapes, either written as a regular square or on its side as a diamond. In 1840, Gutenberg invented the printing press, and at that time what they did is they cut the music out on a piece of wood, and then they stamped that onto the paper. Now, paper at that time was in its early infancy, and it was basically what we'd call early rag, and the hard corners of the square notes had a tendency to rip the paper. Also, at the same time, people who did calligraphy, they had different quills at that time, and they had realized that writing round notes was less time-consuming than writing the square notes. So, over the 15th century, the shape of the notes changed from square notes to round notes, kind of an oval shape. Whatever line that oval shape is written on, that note will take on the name of that line in whatever staff it's in. If the note is written in a space, then the note takes on the name and the pitch of that space in that staff. So the 5-line system is called a staff, and we write the notes on that staff. We either write them on a line or in a space. Now, at the beginning of a line of music, we see another symbol, which is called a clef. And there are different kinds of clefs depending on what kind of instrument you play. Instruments with a high range use what is known as a treble clef. Instruments with a low range will use what is known as a bass clef. Certain instruments use what is known as a C clef, and it can either be in the center here, in which case it's called an alto clef, or it can be up here, and then it's called a tenor clef. As well, there are certain instruments that have very, very low ranges and very, very high ranges. Sometimes you'll see a little 8 above or below a clef, and if the 8 is above, that means you're reading the notes, but you're really hearing them an octave higher. And if there's an 8 below, then you're reading the notes, but you're really hearing them an octave lower. The treble clef is probably the most widely used clef there is. All the high instruments have to play this. In most cases, if you're just looking at a simple lead sheet or a chord chart, it's usually written in treble clef. As a bass player, I've had to learn to read the treble clef to be able to play melodies as well as the bass parts. So that's what we're going to start with. Now, every one of the lines and spaces on this staff represent a different note. And there are a number of ways we can remember what notes are on which lines and spaces. At the beginning, it comes down to memorizing a few mnemonic devices. One of them is the phrase, "Every good boy deserves fun." And if anybody knows anything about music, that's the one phrase they know. What that means is it represents the notes on the bottom line, which is the note E, and then the next line up is the note G, and then the next line up is the note B, and then the next line up is the note D, and then finally on top is the note F. Another mnemonic device is if we write the notes and name the notes that are in the spaces. The bottom one is the note F, and then A, and then C, and the top space is what we call the note E, and that spells out the word face. So those two mnemonic devices, Every Good Boy Deserves Fun and the word face, are what most people use at first to figure out which notes are which. Another way to do it is to take an anchor note. For me, the anchor notes are either the very lowest note, which is the note E on the bottom line, or the note F on the top line, or the note B on the middle line. And then from there, you can count up or down in terms of lines and spaces and go up and down the alphabet. B, C, D, E, and F. Now, if you need to write a note that's higher or lower than that, there is an imaginary space on the top just above the note F, and we call that the note G. The same thing happens on the bottom. Underneath the lowest note on a line, E, is the note D, which can be written in that space just below. Now, if you're writing for an instrument that needs to go either higher or lower than that, in days of old they added more lines. Now what we do is we add a partial line, and this partial line is called a ledger line. And so if I wanted to play the note above G, and since there are only 7 notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, then we go back to A again, and that repeats over and over and over and over. And you end up with those 7 different notes that make up one octave. So if I wanted to go up to the next A, I'd write that, since G is in a space, then I'd write a little partial line and write the note A above that. I try to keep the ledger line the same distance as all the other lines in the staff. Makes it easier to read. So if I want to write a note in the space above that ledger line, that would be the note B. And so the next ledger line up would be the note C. Now the range of the flute takes us all the way up to this C note here. For a lot of instrumentalists, they don't have to read that note, but if they play an instrument where they have to play that note, then they would learn to read that many ledger lines. In general, when we use ledger lines, up to 4 is relatively easy, and then 5 becomes the cutoff point. Anything more than 5, that becomes difficult for most people to read. So if you consistently have to write a passage that is way up in that territory, what we usually do is write it an octave lower, which is much easier to read, and then use that little 8 that sometimes you see above the clef, and what we do is we put an 8 with either a VA or VE, depending on what language it's in, and then a little dotted line that shows how much of this passage needs to be put up the octave, and that's what that symbol means, play up the octave. You can also put it underneath the staff, in which case we usually go 8VB or 8 basso, which means an octave lower, and then a little dotted line with the hook going in the opposite direction. And that means whatever's written there would be played an octave lower than written, so you don't have to get into tons of ledger lines underneath the staff. Large instruments and instruments with a very low range don't use the treble clef, they use what is known as the bass clef. The bass clef is anchored around the note F, and the large dot and the 2 small dots are on that line, that second line from the top, which is the note F. From there we can count up in terms of steps. The space above it would be the note G, and then the top line would be the note A. We're going to use the same notes in the same pattern, going down by 3. And we end up with 2 more mnemonic devices to show what the notes in the bass clef is. The very lowest note in the bass clef is the note G, not E, like in the treble clef. So you have to learn different notes. But from there on, the pattern is consistent. And so they make the mnemonic device consistent as well. In the treble clef, it's Every Good Boy Deserves Fun. In the bass clef, it's Good Boys Deserve Fun Always. And for the notes in the spaces in the bass clef, it's the notes A, C, E, G. So the mnemonic device for that is All Cows Eat Grass. And of course, the other method would be to memorize anchor notes in the bass clef. The middle line in the bass clef is the note D. And from there you can count up or down. In the same way, when you get to the top of the staff, that highest line is the note A. So if you wanted to write the B above it, you'd put it in that space. And so you'd have the note B. Now, if we take a look at the treble clef and the bass clef on top of each other, the space on top of the bass clef is the note B, and the space underneath the treble clef is the note D. In between those two notes, there is just the one note C. And because that's the note, one of the reasons, because it's in between the high clef and the low clef, the treble clef and the bass clef, it's a special type of C. We call that note middle C. There are other clefs as well. If you play the viola, then you will be using something called the alto clef, which is a C clef that is written right in the middle of the staff. When you see a C clef, wherever the two parts come together, that is the note C. And in all instances that I can think of, that's the note middle C. So on the viola, because it has a lower range than the violin, the high parts can be written in the treble clef, and some of the low parts can be written in the bass clef, but instead of jumping back and forth between the two, we just use the viola clef. If you play a bass instrument and you have to get very, very high, sometimes they will jump into something called the tenor clef. This uses another type of C clef, but it's on a different line. It's on the second line from the top, and so that's the note middle C. And then from there on, you have the whole range of notes. Sometimes you see two straight little lines, or sometimes a single thick line, or even a small rectangle. Those are various kinds of percussion clefs. And so when you see those, in most instances, they're not telling you pitches, they're telling you different ranges of instruments to play. 4 different cymbals, or 5 different drums, perhaps. There are also different kinds of clefs that are instrument specific. For example, tab. If you see this clef at the beginning, then that means this no longer represents notes on lines and spaces. This now represents the frets or the place on the instrument where you're going to play these notes. So it's more showing you the actions to be performed than the actual notes played. So, in conclusion, we have a 5-line staff, and we use oval-shaped notes written on lines or spaces to represent the different pitches that we want to write. We can combine a treble staff and a bass staff on top of each other into something called a grand staff, and on that we can write just about any combination of notes we want. If we write them sequentially, that means play one after another. And if we write them on top of each other, that means we play them at the same time. Now, if we compare what we've looked at today with the piano keyboard, this just represents what on this instrument are called the white notes. The black notes, they get their names depending on what white notes they're next to, and that's a concept called accidentals, and we will look at that in the video called Accidentals. I'll see you then.